The Arizona Territory had a way of testing a person's character long before it tested their strength. By the summer of 1889, every creek near Carter Ranch had shrunk into ribbons of muddy water. The grass crunched beneath a horse's hooves like dry straw. Dust drifted across the open prairie with every gust of wind, settling over fences, rooftops, and weary faces alike. Jacob Carter had lived through enough hard seasons to know that kindness became rarer than rain when survival was uncertain. Most folks looked after themselves first. Some never looked beyond that. Jacob was different. At 34, he owned a modest cattle ranch several miles east of Prescott. His neighbors respected him because he never promised more than he could deliver. He worked before sunrise. He repaired his own fences. He rode his own range. And when another rancher found trouble, Jacob usually arrived before anyone asked. That afternoon, he had planned nothing more than checking a broken fence along the northern ridge before heading home. Instead, fate placed someone in his path. His bay gelding suddenly slowed. Its ears pointed toward a rocky canyon ahead. Jacob noticed movement beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees. At first he thought it might be coyotes. Then he saw two figures. A young Apache woman struggled to support an elderly woman whose legs barely obeyed her anymore. The younger woman couldn't have been older than 23. Her buckskin dress was stained with dust. Tiny tears marked the hem where thorn bushes had caught the fabric. Long black braids rested across her shoulders. Despite exhaustion, she kept lifting the older woman's weight with remarkable determination. The elder leaned heavily against her. Each step looked painful. Jacob dismounted without saying a word. The young woman immediately stepped between him and the older woman. She wasn't threatening him. She was protecting someone she loved. Her dark eyes remained steady. Cautious. Ready. Jacob slowly raised both hands away from his revolver. "I'm not looking for trouble." Silence lingered. The wind carried loose sand between them. Finally the woman spoke. Her English carried a soft accent. "My grandmother cannot walk much farther." Jacob glanced beyond them. No horses. No wagon. No supplies worth mentioning. Only one worn blanket and a small leather satchel. "You've been traveling for days." She gave a slight nod. "Our horse died yesterday." Jacob's eyes settled on the elder. Her breathing sounded shallow. Her skin had taken on the pale look of someone fighting dehydration. If they remained out here until nightfall, neither of them would survive. Jacob removed his canteen. He held it out. The young woman hesitated. Then she accepted it. She didn't drink first. Instead, she carefully helped her grandmother sip the water before taking a single swallow herself. Jacob noticed. Most people protected themselves first. She hadn't. After several quiet moments, Jacob asked gently, "Where are you headed?" "To my mother's sister." "How far?" She looked toward distant mountains. "Almost another day's ride." Jacob knew exactly where she meant. On horseback, perhaps. On foot. Impossible. Especially for the elderly woman. He looked at his gelding. The horse shifted patiently beside him. Strong. Healthy. Worth nearly everything Jacob owned besides his ranch. Without it, getting cattle to market would become far more difficult. His neighbors would call him foolish. They probably wouldn't be wrong. The young woman seemed to understand what he was thinking. She slowly shook her head. "No." Jacob looked at her. "If I take your horse." She lowered her eyes. "You may never see it again." There wasn't a trace of deception in her voice. Only honesty. She truly believed there was a chance she couldn't return. Jacob smiled. A calm, genuine smile. "Then bring him back only if you can." For the first time since they'd met, surprise softened her guarded expression. "You trust me?" "I trust what I just saw." She frowned slightly. "What did you see?" "You gave your grandmother the last of the water before yourself." Jacob stepped beside the horse. He placed the reins into her hands. "People who do that usually find their way back." The young woman stared at him, almost as if no stranger had ever offered kindness without demanding something in return. "My name is Aiyana." "Jacob Carter." She repeated his name quietly, committing it to memory. Together, they helped the elderly woman climb into the saddle. Before leaving, Aiyana looked at him once more. "I cannot promise when." "You don't have to. I will remember." Jacob simply tipped his hat. "Safe travels." The horse began walking toward the distant hills. Jacob remained exactly where he stood until the three figures disappeared behind the red cliffs. Only then did he begin the long journey home. On foot. The walk lasted nearly 6 hours beneath relentless heat. His boots filled with dust. Blisters formed before sunset. When he finally reached Carter Ranch, several neighboring ranchers were leaning against the corral fence. One of them laughed. "Jacob, don't tell me you traded away that fine horse." "I loaned him." Another man burst into laughter. "To who?" "An Apache girl." The group exchanged amused looks. One older rancher shook his head. "Well, you'll never see that horse again." Someone else added, "You've got the softest heart in Arizona." Jacob rested both hands on the fence. Maybe they were right. Maybe he'd made the costliest mistake of his life. But every time doubt crept into his thoughts, he remembered one simple moment. Aiyana handing the canteen to her grandmother before drinking herself. That wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without looking back. Days passed. Then another. No hoofbeats echoed down the ranch road. No familiar silhouette appeared against the horizon. Even Jacob began wondering if fate had finally taught him an expensive lesson. Then, just after sunrise on the 6th morning, his ranch dog started barking toward the front gate. Jacob stepped onto the porch. He expected to see a stray traveler. Perhaps a neighbor. Instead, he froze. Standing beyond the gate was something so unexpected that, for several long seconds, he couldn't even move toward it. Jacob remained motionless on the porch. The rising sun cast long golden shadows across the ranch yard, but he barely noticed. His gaze stayed fixed on the front gate. His horse had returned. The bay gelding stood calmly with its reins hanging loose, looking as healthy as the day it had left. But the horse wasn't alone. Standing beside it was Aiyana. She looked different now. The exhaustion that had clouded her face 6 days earlier had faded. Her buckskin dress had been carefully repaired. Fresh beadwork decorated the sleeves. Her long black braids were neatly tied with blue ribbons that shimmered beneath the morning light. Behind her stood nearly a dozen Apache men and women. Some led packhorses. Others pulled small wagons loaded with neatly bundled supplies. No one carried a weapon in their hands. No one appeared hostile. Even so, Jacob instinctively stepped down from the porch. The neighboring ranchers, who had been repairing a nearby fence, immediately noticed the unfamiliar visitors. Within minutes, several men quietly reached for their rifles. One whispered, "Jacob. That's a whole Apache party." Another muttered, "I don't like this." Jacob ignored them. He walked toward the gate alone. Aiyana smiled softly the moment she saw him. "I told you I would remember." Jacob couldn't help laughing. "I'll admit, I started wondering." She gently patted the horse's neck. "He behaved better than some people." Jacob rubbed the gelding's nose. "I missed you too." For a brief moment, everyone relaxed. Then the crowd behind Aiyana slowly parted. An elderly woman stepped forward. It was the grandmother Jacob had seen barely able to stand in the canyon. Now she walked without assistance. Her movements were slower than those of younger people, yet steady. Her silver hair had been braided carefully beneath a woven shawl. She stopped a few feet from Jacob. Then, to everyone's surprise, she bowed her head. Not deeply. Just enough to show genuine respect. "My grandson," she said softly in Apache before Aiyana translated. Jacob looked confused. "I don't understand." Aiyana smiled. "My grandmother says. You gave life when you expected nothing. Among our people. That creates family." The word settled quietly over the ranch yard. Jacob had never expected gratitude. He certainly hadn't expected to be welcomed like kin. The elder reached into one of the wagons. She removed a beautifully handcrafted saddle blanket woven with striking red and turquoise patterns. It was unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. She carefully placed it into his hands. Then came another gift. A finely carved hunting knife. Then sacks of dried corn. Buffalo hides. Medicinal herbs. Leather tack. Even 2 healthy young horses. Jacob stared in disbelief. "I can't accept all of this." Aiyana gently shook her head. "You already have. When you trusted a stranger." One by one, members of the Apache group unloaded their wagons. By the time they finished, the supplies nearly filled Jacob's barn. The neighboring ranchers watched in stunned silence. Only a week earlier, they had mocked Jacob for giving away his horse. Now the very people they had expected to steal from him were bringing enough supplies to help his ranch through the coming winter. Old Mr. Dawson slowly removed his hat. "I've lived here 30 years. I've never seen anything like this." Neither had Jacob. Later that morning, everyone gathered beneath the large cottonwood tree beside the ranch house. Aiyana translated while her grandmother spoke. "Our people once survived because strangers showed mercy. Kindness should never die with one generation." She paused before continuing. "Your ranch stands on land our ancestors once crossed during the Great Drought." Jacob listened quietly. The elder pointed toward a line of distant hills. "There is water beneath those rocks." Jacob frowned. "Water?" She nodded. "A spring. Hidden. It has never gone dry." Jacob looked toward the hills. He had ridden that land for years. He had searched for water every dry season. Yet he'd never found a spring. Aiyana noticed his expression. "It isn't easy to see. My grandfather taught only a few people where it is." The elder smiled gently. "Now. You should know too." Jacob opened his mouth to respond. Before he could, the sound of galloping horses echoed across the valley. Everyone turned. 5 riders approached the ranch at full speed. Dust rolled behind them like a storm. The man leading them wore an expensive black coat instead of trail clothes. Silver spurs flashed beneath polished boots. Even before he stopped his horse, Jacob recognized him. Silas Boone. The largest land buyer in the county. A man whose wealth had grown from convincing struggling ranchers to sell for almost nothing. Silas surveyed the Apache visitors with obvious annoyance. "Well. This is interesting." His smile never reached his eyes. Jacob folded his arms. "What brings you here?" Silas reached into a leather satchel. He unfolded several official-looking documents. "I've recently purchased property surrounding this ranch." He paused deliberately. "There's just one small problem." He held up the papers. "According to county records, the northern section of your ranch belongs to me." Jacob's expression hardened. "That's impossible. I've owned that land for years." Silas shrugged casually. Maybe. Maybe not. He glanced toward the wagons filled with gifts. I suppose your new friends won't mind helping you move. Several Apache men instinctively stepped forward. Aiyana quietly lifted one hand. They stopped immediately. She walked until she stood beside Jacob. Her voice remained calm. He trusted us before anyone else did. We will not leave. Silas studied her for several seconds. Then he smiled again. Cold. Calculated. I'll return in 3 days. With the sheriff. And papers that will remove every one of you. Without another word, he turned his horse. The other riders followed. Silence lingered after they disappeared beyond the ridge. Jacob stared at the documents still resting in his hands. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. He had inherited that land legally from his father. Every boundary had been surveyed years ago. Yet Silas looked far too confident to be bluffing. Before anyone could discuss it further, a terrified scream erupted from behind the barn. Jacob spun around. A stable hand came running toward them. His face had gone completely pale. Jacob. The hay barn. It's on fire. Everyone looked toward the western pasture. A thick column of black smoke climbed rapidly into the clear Arizona sky. And the flames were spreading straight toward the horse corrals. Jacob didn't wait for another word. He sprinted toward the barn before the stable hand finished speaking. Smoke rolled across the ranch yard in thick black waves. The dry Arizona wind fed the flames, pushing them from the hay storage toward the horse corrals with frightening speed. Inside the nearest pen, terrified horses kicked against the wooden rails. Their panicked cries echoed across the valley. Without hesitation, Jacob grabbed a heavy blanket from a water trough and threw it across his shoulders. Get every animal out. Ranch hands scattered in every direction. Several neighbors who had mocked him only days earlier rushed forward to help. Aiyana was already moving. She didn't freeze. She didn't panic. She turned toward the Apache riders. Speaking rapidly in her own language, she pointed toward the rocky hills north of the ranch. The warriors immediately mounted their horses and disappeared. Jacob barely noticed. His entire focus remained on the burning barn. He kicked open the stable door. Heat struck him like the opening of an oven. One frightened mare had become trapped beneath a collapsed beam. Jacob ignored the sparks falling around him. He dropped to one knee and strained with everything he had. The beam barely moved. His boots slipped across the burning floor. For a brief second, he realized he might not get out. Then another pair of hands grabbed the timber. Aiyana. She had run straight into the fire beside him. You'll be crushed. Jacob shouted. So will the horse. Together they lifted just enough for the mare to crawl free. Jacob slapped the frightened animal toward the open doorway. Outside, the rest of the herd thundered into the pasture. The roof groaned overhead. Aiyana grabbed Jacob's arm. Now. They dove through the doorway just as part of the roof collapsed behind them. A shower of burning timber exploded into the stable. Everyone stood frozen. If they had hesitated another heartbeat, neither of them would have survived. Jacob leaned against the fence, breathing hard. He looked toward Aiyana. Ash covered her face. A small burn marked one sleeve of her dress. She noticed him staring. You saved me. She smiled gently. I believe we saved each other. Before Jacob could answer, the Apache riders returned. But they weren't alone. Several men carried long wooden poles. Others dragged woven leather hoses. Still others hauled barrels already filled with water. Jacob stared in disbelief. Where did you find all that? Aiyana pointed toward the northern hills. The spring. Within minutes, the Apache men had opened a narrow stone channel hidden beneath brush and loose rock. Clear water rushed downhill. Not a trickle. A steady stream. Enough to feed bucket after bucket. The ranchers formed a line. Apache families. Cowboys. Neighbors. Everyone passed water together. No one stopped to ask who belonged to which side. They simply fought the fire. After nearly 2 exhausting hours, the flames finally surrendered. The barn had suffered heavy damage. Several walls had collapsed. Much of the hay was gone. Yet every horse survived. The ranch house still stood. No lives had been lost. Jacob wiped soot from his forehead. Something didn't make sense. He walked around the back of the burned building. There, near the dry grass, he found a broken glass bottle stuffed with charred cloth. The smell of lamp oil lingered in the air. His expression darkened. This wasn't an accident. Sheriff Thomas Reed arrived before sunset after one of the neighboring ranchers rode into town. The sheriff examined the burned bottle carefully. "I'd say someone wanted this place gone." Jacob didn't need to guess who. Neither did the sheriff. The following morning, Silas Boone returned exactly as promised. Only this time he arrived with 2 lawyers. He smiled the moment he saw the damaged barn. Terrible luck. Jacob stepped forward. "I found the bottle." Silas's smile faded slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will." Sheriff Reed appeared from behind the ranch house. "So will the federal marshal." Silas blinked. "The what?" Moments later, another wagon rolled into the yard carrying Deputy U.S. Marshal Henry Collins. The marshal unfolded several official documents. "We've been investigating forged land claims throughout Yavapai County." He looked directly at Silas. "Your name appears on nearly every complaint." Silas's confidence disappeared. He tried to protest. "The papers are legal." The marshal calmly held up another document. "They're not. The county surveyor testified yesterday. Your boundaries were altered after they were filed." Sheriff Reed placed the burned bottle on the wagon seat. "We also found traces of the same lamp oil in your supply wagon." One of Silas's hired men suddenly lowered his head. "I didn't want anyone hurt." Silas turned toward him. "You fool." The ranch hand swallowed hard. "He paid me to burn the barn." Silence settled across the ranch. Everything unraveled in seconds. The forged deeds. The attempted land theft. The fire. The intimidation. It had all been planned. Deputy Marshal Collins stepped forward. "Silas Boone. You're under arrest." The wealthy land buyer said nothing as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. For the first time in years, no amount of money could buy his way free. As the wagons rolled away, the valley grew quiet once again. Several days later, engineers from Prescott examined the hidden spring. Everything Aiyana's grandmother had said proved true. The underground water source was large enough to support several ranches through even the harshest summers. Rather than keeping it for himself, Jacob made a different choice. He invited neighboring ranchers and the Apache community to help build shared irrigation channels. Some people questioned him. "You could become the richest rancher in the territory." Jacob simply smiled. Water shouldn't belong to one family when it can save hundreds. The project took months. Apache craftsmen shaped stone channels through the hills. Cowboys dug trenches across the prairie. Families who had once avoided one another now shared meals beneath the same cottonwood trees each evening. Old prejudices slowly disappeared. Not because someone demanded they should. Because people had worked side by side long enough to recognize one another's humanity. One autumn afternoon, Aiyana's grandmother walked slowly toward Jacob. In her hands rested a beautifully woven blanket unlike any she had ever given before. She draped it across his shoulders. Then she looked into his eyes. When you gave away your horse. You believed you were helping two strangers. She smiled warmly. You were actually bringing home your own family. Jacob felt his throat tighten. 4. Perhaps the first time since losing both of his parents years earlier. The word family no longer sounded like a memory. It sounded like the future. A few weeks later, beneath towering cottonwood trees beside the spring that had changed so many lives, Jacob and Aiyana were married. There were no grand speeches. No expensive decorations. Only friends. Neighbors. Children laughing beside the creek. Apache drums blended naturally with the joyful music of fiddles played by local ranchers. Jacob's old bay gelding stood quietly beneath a nearby tree, occasionally nudging Aiyana's shoulder as though approving the ceremony. Everyone laughed. Even the horse seemed happy. 1 year later. Carter Ranch had become something far greater than a cattle ranch. Widows found shelter there. Travelers were welcomed with a warm meal. Children who had lost their parents could always find a safe bed. No one was turned away because of the color of their skin, the language they spoke, or the place they came from. Jacob and Aiyana often stood together on the front porch each evening, watching horses graze beneath the golden Arizona sunset while laughter echoed across the fields. Nearby, Aiyana patiently taught young girls both Apache traditions and English reading lessons. The hidden spring continued flowing, just as it always had. Not because one man had discovered it, but because many people had chosen to protect it together. At the entrance to Carter Ranch stood a simple wooden sign carved by both Apache craftsmen and local ranchers. It carried only a few words. Kindness always finds its way home. Every traveler who passed through those gates eventually learned the same lesson. Sometimes the greatest reward for helping a stranger isn't getting your kindness returned. It's discovering that one selfless decision can create a family you never knew you were missing.